Thank you very much, Brother Lachlan. And now we very much look forward to the words of our brother Carl, Israel, the prince who had power with God.
Well, thank you, Brother Nick, and good evening, brothers and sisters and young people. Well, we left our study, didn't we, with Jacob coming home. It was now time to come home. The 40 years' labour within Syria had had a remarkable effect upon Jacob's life. A man who had endured enormous deprivation, a man who had been exploited by Laban, was now ready to come home. And God asked him to come home. Now, we need to understand that the seriousness of this move. If you come across to Deuteronomy 26, we have a divine reflection upon what was happening in Syria. Now, Deuteronomy 26 is a chapter that says that when you come back into the land, Israel, I want you to put the first fruits of the produce that you receive in a basket, and I want you to bring that basket to the priest, and I want you to offer that to the priest. And I want you to say these words in Deuteronomy 26, verse 5. And thou shalt speak and say before Yahweh in the presence of the priest, a Syrian ready to perish was my father. And he went down into Egypt and sojourned there with a few and became there a nation, great, mighty, and populous. Now I want you to notice that expression. He was a Syrian ready to perish. And what that's saying is that if Jacob had lingered in Syria for any time longer, in the end, Syria would have swallowed him up. And that's the seriousness of the end of that 40 years. You know, the pressure was becoming unbearable in that place. It was driving his spirituality, sucking the life out of him, having to do with people like Laban. And God said that when you come back in the land, Israel, I want you to confess exactly what Jacob was feeling, a Syrian ready to perish. And that's the importance of this homecoming, this return to the land of the fathers. If he hadn't have done that, in the end, he would have perished, spiritually destroyed by that environment after those 40 years. Well, we read in chapter 32 and verse 1 that Jacob went on his way and the angels of God met him. It was the custom of the day that when an important visitor crossed into your territory, that person would be met by the ambassadors of the state. Well, there's no exception with God, and you can imagine, can't you? As Jacob comes into Gilead, crossing into the borders of Israel, and their company, as it were just coming around the bend of a hill, and there in front of them was this magnificent display of power. An amazing, incredible sight. And I suspect, brothers and sisters, it wasn't just Jacob that saw that, but the whole company. They met him. This was a meeting. And to imagine the company seeing this magnificent host before them would have been absolutely startling, absolutely amazing. These are the cherubim that are guarding the way to the tree of life. The angels of God, these are the ones that were ascending and descending at Genesis 28. And now they're there for everyone to see, and there's a meeting. They met each other in the way. What an astounding thing. As we mentioned in a previous study, the problem with our finite minds is that when something's out of sight, it's out of mind. Out of sight, out of mind. And I wonder how many of us have been conscious of the encampment of the angels. Now, we know the quotation from Hebrews chapter 1, don't we? And verse 14, that the angels are ministering spirits sent forth to minister to those who shall be heirs of salvation. But I want you to ponder that expression, heirs of salvation. This is how the angels view us. Not Christadelphians, although we are Christadelphians. Inheritors of salvation. And that high esteem that they place upon us, brothers and sisters, is a testimony to the wonder of God's mercy. And sometimes the way we treat each other is entirely different to that high esteem the angels have of us. If that's their viewpoint of us, brothers and sisters, how much more should it be amongst ourselves to esteem others better than ourselves? Heirs of salvation. An astounding thought. This brother over here, he's going to get eternal life, and I'm going to work with him. He is an heir of salvation. This sister over here, I brought her to the truth. She's responded to the truth. I want her in the kingdom. She's an heir of salvation. And as those angels of God met Jacob in the way, that enormous, powerful message was being demonstrated, the whole company, that God is absolutely faithful. Absolutely faithful. And the only barrier that stands between us and the kingdom is ourselves. It's the only thing that's going to stop us getting into the kingdom. Our Jacob-like tendencies, if they're not changed. And we give very little attention to that, do we? As I said, out of sight, out of mind. And it's a sad thing, isn't it? To be God-conscious, to be conscious of the divine providence of these wonderful spirit beings ministering to us who undeservedly are the heirs of salvation. An enormous privilege that stands. When Jacob saw them, he said, this is God's host. And that word host is the Hebrew word mahane. It means an encampment. It's not an army, it's an encampment. Same word used of the camp of Israel in the wilderness. All laid out in front of Jacob. A disciplined host, an encampment, a mahane. Psalm 34 verse 7 says, the angel of Yahweh encampeth around those that fear him and delivereth him. One angel can surround an encampment. How much more powerful is this wonderful, glorious host? And Jacob called the place Mahanaim. That's the plural. Two camps, his camp and the angel's camp. And he felt very safe alongside the angelic campsite. We don't know how long they manifested themselves to the encampment. It probably wouldn't have been very long, but it was enough to make that dramatic impression. God keeps his promises. I will bring thee again into this land, and here they are. The very angels that you saw ascending and descending, here they are. I'm with you, Jacob. I'm absolutely faithful. And we can have that tremendous confidence in our God. And intellectually we know that, brothers and sisters. But when it comes to the situation where we're put under pressure, that very belief is challenged, isn't it, at times? To believe that God is with us is a mark of great faith. Now, God has got further work to do with Jacob. You see, Jacob has this anxiety problem. You see, in chapter 31, verse 31, Laban said to Jacob, why are you running away secretly? And he said in chapter 31, verse 31, because I was afraid. For I said, peradventure thou wouldest take by force thy daughters from me. In this chapter, in chapter 32, we're going to see twice, Jacob is afraid. And it's one of those qualities that you don't suspect is in the man. The man that can sit through night and day, through heat and frost to look after sheep. You think it's a very hardy, sturdy kind of man, capable of withstanding the forces of nature, looking after these sheep. And yet in that makeup, brothers and sisters, there was this anxiousness. But when he felt threatened, he became very fearful, exceedingly fearful. Now in the scriptures, faith and fear are antitheses, exact opposites. And whilst you're manifesting fear, you cannot manifest faith. Like the Lord said to Jairus, stop fearing, go on believing. When you're fearful and when you're afraid, you lack the trust that God can give you a solution to that. It's a natural reaction, but it needs to be conquered. And Jacob had this issue, and God has to deal with that. I was afraid. Now, in verse 3 of chapter 32, Jacob sends messengers. It's actually the same word malak used of the angels. See, there are two encampments. One camp's got some messengers, and Jacob's camp's got another group of messengers. There's a parallel here. He's seeing this two camps. You know, this is an amazing thing. This is a conscious decision to reconcile with Esau. It would have been far easier to take the easy way out, cross the Jordan at Beth-shan, go across the Jezreel Valley, turn south and go all the way down south. Nice and easy, nice and straightforward, and reach Bethel. Very easy. But instead, he made a deliberate action by crossing the Jabbok to go through Moab, on the way to Edom, to cross over near Jericho and go up into the wilderness of Judea. That's a conscious decision. You know, it's a very, very important principle, brothers and sisters, to understand. And the Lord spoke about that, didn't he, in Matthew chapter 5? And he draws this picture of a worshipper in line with his offering. And as the offerers in front of that person begin to offer sacrifice, and he's getting closer and closer and closer to the altar, he suddenly realizes that there's an issue between himself and a brother. And he leaves the queue. First be reconciled with thy brother, and then make thy offering. And that is a much harder path to do. It would have been easy for Jacob just to put Esau out of mind. He's miles away. Take that easy route back to Bethel, but he didn't. He made a conscious decision that he needed to reconcile with his brother. It is an amazing and wonderful spirituality. He left Canaan secretly and in haste. He left Syria secretly and in haste. He's not going to do the same thing when it comes to coming back to the land. He's going to face that responsibility, and he's going to try and reconcile with Esau, his brother. Sometimes, brothers and sisters, it's not possible to reconcile. Sometimes the other person's not going to talk to you, or won't talk to you, or won't reason with you. But we have to do everything we possibly can to try and reach, to reconcile, to do all in our power, praying that God will, in fact, overwatch that. First be reconciled to thy brother, and then offer thy sacrifice. How difficult that is to do. But Jacob made that conscious decision he was going to do that. Now, you probably recognize that as chapter 32 was read this evening, there was a constant repetition in which Jacob called Esau my Lord. And I am his servant. 7 times in that record. Got a colouring in pencil? Here's a good exercise. It's in verse 4. It's in verse 5. It's in verse 18. It's across in chapter 33, verse 8. Chapter 33, verse 13. Chapter 33, verse 14. And chapter 33, verse 15. Consistently. Now, what is the record trying to say? Why is it that Jacob is calling Esau my Lord? Isn't this contrary to the promise that was given that the elder shall serve the younger? Why would he call his older brother Lord and himself a servant if he knew that he was chosen of God? Well, there is in this amazing choice of words an acknowledgement by Jacob that as far as this world's goods are concerned, Esau was the rightful firstborn. The promise that God had given to Rebekah was dealing with spiritual firstbornship, spiritual issues, things which were yet to come. And in relation to the natural firstborn rights, what Jacob is saying to Esau is Esau, I'm apologizing. You are my Lord, and I am thy servant. You know, it's a little bit like Daniel's friends, isn't it? When they faced the rewards of Babylon. And in the end, Daniel said, thy gifts be to thyself. I'm not interested in material wealth. Not interested at all in material wealth. It's like Abraham before Sodom, the king of Sodom. Not interested in your wealth. Esau, as far as I'm concerned, you can have all of those things. Because you see, the important things, the spiritual things, those are the things that I have sought and I have received. Now, there is in that an enormous humility in Jacob. 40 years ago, you would never have seen that in Jacob. But 40 years of service, 40 years of hard knocks, of experience, of providential control, had developed in this man this sense of humility in service. And I think he began to realize that the principle that our Lord said, that whoever of you will be chiefest shall be servant of all. And that humility and deference to Esau's status was behind this term. Humility and respect, two qualities in short supply 40 years before. So, in verse 4, he commanded his servants, saying, "Ye shall speak to my lord Esau, thy servant Jacob said thus, I have sojourned with Laban and stayed there until now. I have oxen, asses, flocks, men servants and women servants, and I have sent to tell my lord that I may find grace in thy sight." This is so un-Jacob-like 40 years before. You see, if I'm seeking favor from somebody else, it means that I am dependent on their goodwill. Now, 40 years before, he was snatching at the birthright. He was taking it by force. He was forcing God's hand, as it were. And this time, 40 years later, he said, look, I'm seeking thy mercy. I'm seeking thy grace. I'm seeking thy favor. There's no grasping here. It's expressing his dependence on somebody else's favor. This is a different Jacob, isn't it? An entirely different man. Well, the messengers go off in verse 6. And they come back in verse 6. We came to thy brother Esau, and also he cometh to meet thee, and 400 men with him. So there was no reciprocal kindness. There was no thank you very much. There was not a word in reply, except they're coming with 400 men. And Jacob has this predisposition to immediately assume the worst. Because there is no gesture of friendship, because there's this menacing silence and this huge force, 400 men. And Jacob knew that when Isaac blessed Esau, by thy sword thou shalt live. They weren't coming with balloons, they were coming with swords. Esau was now a powerful force to be reckoned with, and Jacob was defenseless. And there was in him this assumption of the worst. So verse 7 says this, and here's Jacob's real problem. He was greatly afraid and distressed. Now he had just seen the encampment of God in all its splendor, its glory, and its power. And yet he still is greatly afraid and distressed. Fear is an incredible thing, isn't it, when you think about that? It has the power to consume the mind and agitate the senses to the exclusion of having seen just very, very previously the encampment of God. That's why fear and faith are opposites, antithesis. God's got to deal with that and try and show the need for faith. And he's distressed. The Hebrew word means to compress, to put someone in a narrow position. He felt absolutely constrained. He felt the world closing in on him. And so he reverts to his natural defensive posture. He's got a plan, a very clever plan. But that's the problem. He plans first and he prays second. It should have been the other way round. Should have been the other way round. Fear and distress. I'm sure, brothers and sisters, we have been in positions where we have been afraid. Circumstances have come upon us and fear has taken over. And I wonder, in that circumstance, which came first? The defensive, I've got the solution kind of approach, or whether prayer came first. It's a good test, isn't it, discipleship? So the two camps become three, you see, because in verse 7, he divides, splits into two, the people that were with him, the flocks and the herds, the camels, into two bands. Mahanaim, actually, is the Hebrew word. There's now three. Instead of drawing closer to God's encampment, he's splitting his own camp. There's now three. And in fact, he makes it worse because he's going to split that again into droves. So drove after drove after drove, he's splitting and splitting and splitting the encampment. And the more he's splitting, the more he's moving away from God's encampment. And we can imagine, can't we, his wives and his dependents gathering around him in dismay and agitation. They can sense the fear, they can sense the desperation, and the children catching the infectious panic that's going around the camp, cowering with cries and tears and holding on to their mums and trying to work out what's going on here as the camp is rudely shaken and divided and divided and divided again. And that's what fear does. And in verse 8, Jacob reveals to us his reasoning. He said, if Esau come to one Mahanah, one company, and smite it, then the other company which is left shall escape. And you can almost hear the reasoning in his mind. And I think it dawned on him. It dawned on him that there was another two possibilities. One is that Esau will get both camps. And the second possibility, which is outlined at the end of verse 11, is, I fear lest he'll take one encampment that's got my wives and children in. And all of a sudden, as he's going through all this reasoning and he's dividing the host, it dawned on him that there's a flaw in all of this. And God slowly bringing him to realization that much more is required than just dividing your house. So in verse 9, we have this wonderful prayer that at last he's driven to utter. Because he realizes his plans are just not going to work. Not going to work at all. God's brought him to this point. O God of my father Abraham, he says in verse 9, and God of my father Isaac, Yahweh, which says to me, return unto thy country and to thy kindred, and I will deal well with thee. I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies and of all the truth which thou hast shown unto thy servant. It is a genuine, heartfelt, personal prayer. And God has got him to that point. It's a prayer which reminds God of his promises. There's nothing wrong with reminding God of his promises. And frequently we read of the petitions of the worthy of old, of actually asking God to remember the promises that he's made. It's not impudence to do that. It's faithfulness. It's expressing trust and belief in the promises that God has made. But when he said in verse 10, I am not worthy, the Hebrew is, I am too little for the least of all the mercies and of all the truth. He confesses his smallness, that there is no pride now, no sense of invincibility and strength. Like his grandfather Abraham, I am but dust and ashes, less than dust and ashes. Just insignificant, just too little. for all the mercies, plural, and all the truth. That word mercies is our word chesed, which means steadfast kindness. God is kind, and there's a steadfastness behind that kindness. And Jacob's appreciation of God's undeserved favor is the exact opposite of a man who is self-reliant. He's been brought to this position. Kindness and truth, mercy and truth, faithfulness and truth. These are all the expressions that meant by those two Hebrew words. Come across to Exodus chapter 34. It's the very essence of God's character. The proclamation of the name in verse 6. Yahweh passed by before him and proclaimed, Yahweh, Yahweh, El, he who will be power. What is that power? Merciful and gracious, long-suffering and abundant in goodness and truth. There it is. Mercy and truth, goodness and truth. And God says, I'm abundant in that. You look over your life, and I wonder whether, brothers and sisters, we could summarize God's dealing with us in our life in the truth as being abundant goodness and truth. Do you see the hand of God like that? Or is it all just too hard and too difficult? Abundant in goodness and truth. And Jacob's standing there and saying, I recognize that. And I'm just too little to have any of that. In John chapter 1, come across to John chapter 1, that mercy and truth is expressed so beautifully by John in his first chapter. For mankind to understand the abundance of goodness and truth in a God they cannot see, that manifestation has been made in a Son. And we read in John chapter 1 and verse 14, and the Word, the purpose, the plan of God, the wisdom of God became flesh and dwelt among us, full of mercy and truth, full of mercy and truth. In verse 16, of his fullness have all we received, grace upon grace, mercy upon mercy. That's our God. That's the wonder of our God. There's an abundance of that. And if we are to manifest the character of God, if we are to reflect those qualities need to be in us. Now, he didn't say mercy or truth. It's not option take your pick. It's mercy and truth. Mercy and truth. And that wonderful sense of balance between favor and kindness and what's right and true and proper is God's abundant character. And we are asked to reflect that to our wives, to our brothers and sisters, to our children, to those outside in the world. This abundance of mercy and truth. Let's come back to Genesis, shall we? Genesis chapter 32. Jacob on his knees confessing that I'm just too little. Just too little for any of that to happen. This is a different Jacob. A different Jacob. Thou hast showed it to thy servant. Thou hast done it to thy servant. For with my staff have I passed over this Jordan, says verse 10, and now I am become two bands. Fear divides and splits. And God has to bring him back upon the path. But the prayer continues, you see, in verse 11. It's a prayer for deliverance. Deliver me, I pray thee, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him. Now, he's very open, isn't he? He's very, very transparent with Almighty God. Now, that word deliver means to snatch away. Snatch me away. It's a forcefulness, isn't it? Snatch me away from the hand of my brother. The hand of my brother. You know, this was the hand of Esau, the hand of Jacob grasped the heel of Esau, and the hand of Jacob, which had the skins of deceit, And now it's all about the hand of Esau, the power of Esau. You know, in Jeremiah 31, just keep your hand across here. Jeremiah 31, we have a little allusion to this event because it's going to happen again, but on a national basis. Jeremiah 31. And Jeremiah 31 is the return of the Jewish people from captivity. They're coming back from Syria, from other parts of the world. There's a second Exodus occurring. Being brought, in verse 8 of Jeremiah 31, from the north country, the place where Jacob came out. They're weeping and supplication. And verse 11 says this of Jeremiah 31, "For Yahweh hath redeemed Jacob and ransomed him from the hand of him that was stronger than he. Snatched me away from the hand of Esau." And in the future, the nation of Israel will come out of captivity. They'll be humbled like Jacob was humbled. They will lean upon their God. And in that verse, God will rescue them from the hand of him that's stronger than he, the Russian host, the power of the enemy, which has decimated and destroyed that nation. Deliver me, I pray thee, for I fear lest he will come and smite me and the mother with the children. And there he has this graphic picture in his mind of the mother, which is a symbol of all of the mothers, over their children, protecting them from the slaughter of Esau. It was graphic in his mind. And the mothers being unable to protect their children, the whole lot being slaughtered. That's how he felt. That's how much the fear had taken hold of him. And in verse 12, "Thou saidst to me, I surely will do thee good, and make thy seed as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude." God, you have promised me an innumerable multitude. And yet if Esau comes and slaughters us, your promises can never be fulfilled. And that was the end of the prayer. "Thou hast said to me, I will surely do thee good." And God keeps his promises. Now, how is he going to deliver Jacob? Put yourself in the company of the angels and looking at this, if you like, from far. How is God going to maneuver all of these circumstances to deliver and snatch Jacob away from this horrific fear that he's got? Well, despite that prayer, brothers and sisters, he again reverts to being a Jacob. In verse 13, he lodged there that same night and took of that which came to his hand. Now, can you see the way the record's presenting this? He's offered this incredible prayer, seeking God's deliverance. That same night he offered that prayer. In verse 13, he took of that which came to his hand. That is, he took that which was under his hand or under his control. And that's his weakness. He needs to be in control of his destiny. Now, I would suggest, brothers and sisters, that kind of quality is present amongst quite a few people here this evening. We like to be in control of our destiny. We like to know where we're going. We like to have everything wrapped up in neat parcels and have the answer to the problems and solutions that we have. We'd like to be in control. And Jacob has taken that to another level. He needs to feel that he's got to do something to determine the outcome. He's forcing the hand of God. He's just prayed this wonderful prayer, but he can't help himself. He cannot help himself. He needs to feel like he's in control of his own destiny. And God's got to handle that and deal with that. You see, if God intervened, he had to intervene, which means there's something wrong with Jacob's thinking here. He had to bring Jacob back on course. I mean, if Jacob had prayed this prayer and left it to God, then there was no need for this wrestling match that's about to appear. And what Jacob's plan is a very, very clever plan, that if he can get these animals to go drove by drove and wear down Esau's resistance, then he would have achieved something. Very clever plan. 550 animals he assembled that night. In the dark, trying to round up bullocks and goats and lambs and sheep with torches. Can you imagine how difficult that is? How pre-planned that is? 550 animals, all herded, scattered, all into droves in the middle of the night. Thought it through very, very carefully. And his argument is in verse 20. I'll read to you Young's literal. I will cover his face with the present which goes before my face, and afterwards I will see his face. Perhaps he will lift up my face. So it was a covering of the face. His anger needed to be covered. All of this maneuvering, he hopes to persuade Esau. Now, do you know what, brothers and sisters? Just come across to chapter 33 and verse 8. All of these droves, all of this manipulation, all of this planning, they all come before Esau. And do you know what Esau said in chapter 33, verse 8? What on earth do you mean by all these droves? It had absolutely zero impact on Esau. Jacob, what are you doing? What do you mean by all of these droves? So all of this effort that Jacob had put into it, all of this scheming, all of this planning, when it finally came down to the wire, Esau said, what on earth's going on, Jacob? It had zero impact on Esau. God had brought all those plans to nothing because he had another intention in mind. Keep it, he says, keep it. I've got enough. Not interested. Absolutely astounding, isn't it? Well, in verse 21, coming back to chapter 32 and verse 21, as the present went over, Jacob lodged that night in the encampment. There's our Mahane again. So he sends all the droves across, all the presents across, and he's by himself with his family. And in verse 22, he rose up that night, took his 2 wives, his 2 women servants, his 11 sons, and passed over the ford Jabbok. Now, the river Jabbok is a significant trench in the earth. You may have seen photographs. Some of you may have even visited the area of Jabbok in Jordan. It's a massive trench in the earth, like a great scar that goes through part of Jordan. And it's a significant thing. In the middle of the night, to go all the way down to the river torrent and find the ford, come up the other side, and then continue on through there. A significant thing in the middle of the night. He's desperate. And then in verse 22, he crosses the brook. The Hebrew word is different. It's a small tributary. So he's past the great main gorge, and he then, to the left of that, he sends his family away again out of sight across another tributary. This is defensive, isn't it? And then we have this very sad verse in verse 24. And Jacob was left alone. And that's telling us more than that he was just the only man standing. It's telling us that in every sense of the word, he was alone and without God. It's telling us, brothers and sisters, that he is truly alone. And when you get to that part of a person's life, when there's no other person and you are absolutely alone, then that's when God is going to start working. Run out of plans, nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. He is absolutely alone. And you imagine standing there, alone, in the middle of the night, without God. That prayer has almost been a distant memory as he's been crazily and frantically getting these 550 animals organized into droves in the middle of the night. And that's when God acted and intervened. And you imagine Jacob standing there, pondering all of this and working things through and trying to get all the schemes going, and the family's over there safe, and the droves are over there, and it's the middle of the night, and what am I going to do next? All of a sudden, someone grabs him. Someone grabs him. He's alone, he's afraid, and out of nowhere, out of the darkness, comes this figure, this unknown figure, and starts wrestling him to the ground. Frightening, absolutely frightening. Jacob turns and tries to grapple and grasp with this individual. There wrestled with him a man. We're told in Hosea chapter 12 and verse 3 that it was an angel who had detached himself from the camp. One of these mighty ones of God with enormous power, grabbing him and wrestling with him until the breaking of the day. And during that night, the man's identity is hidden. It would have been frightening, struggling and wrestling and on the ground and then up again. In fact, that word wrestle means to get dusty, to grapple and get dusty. They're thrashing around in the dirt. What is the meaning of this struggle? Why did God choose to struggle with Jacob? Well, God is going to bring a very pertinent lesson in front of Jacob. See, verse 25 says that when the angel saw that he prevailed not against him. Now, we have an all-powerful angel, and the record says that this all-powerful angel could not overcome and prevail against Jacob. Now, that doesn't make any sense. Of course the angel could win this competition, this wrestling match. What is the record saying? When the angel saw that he couldn't overcome Jacob, and it's a parable of the life that Jacob was living. It's an attempt, brothers and sisters, it's an attempt of God to try and get through to Jacob. Yield, Jacob, yield to my will. And Jacob's fighting back. And the angel is trying to get Jacob to voluntarily understand, just yield. But he wouldn't. And it doesn't matter what God threw at Jacob. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes it was 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes that Jacob fought God back. God is trying to get through to Jacob. You need to yield to my will, Jacob. And when the angel saw that he prevailed not, he was looking for Jacob to surrender. And Jacob refused. He refused to give in to God. And when the angel saw that through all of the circumstances of life, he could not get Jacob to yield, he forces the issue and he cripples Jacob. He could have done that right at the beginning. This is going to be a 2-stage lesson, brothers and sisters and young people. And all he had to do was just touch the hollow of the thigh, the socket joint. And it would have been absolutely excruciating agony. As all of a sudden, Jacob's collapsed. The thigh is the longest and strongest bone in the body. It represents the strength of man, and he's absolutely crippled. And the confidence in the flesh that he had has been significantly and dramatically removed. He couldn't use his leg. He would just be collapsing in absolute sheer agony. And all his natural self-sufficiency gone in a moment. In one swift stroke, the divine hand had rendered him utterly and absolutely powerless. That's what I've been trying to do all the time, Jacob. And you've refused to yield. You've refused to surrender. And the angel said, let go. I've had it. Finished. The conflict's over. And here comes phase 2 of the lesson. Now that he can't actually do anything, now that he can't wrestle, now that he can't resist the will of God, he clings to him. And the angel said, let me go. Let me go. And Jacob's saying, I will not let thee go until thou bless me. Let me go. I will not let you go. So he's moved from wrestling and struggling to just hanging on. Just hanging on. And the angel is testing him. Let me go. I won't let you go. And he's transferred this holding of his brother's heel to holding and hanging on to God. And the tenacity now has just changed dramatically. But there's something else in the picture here. Come to Hosea chapter 12. There's another dimension in this picture that's not revealed in the Genesis record, and we need Hosea 12 to fill in the gap. So Hosea chapter 12, verse 3, he took his brother by the heel in the womb, and by his strength he had power with God. So this is talking about this incident. By the way, the Revised Version says, in his manhood he had power with God. He's grown up. He's mature. And here's the additional information we didn't have in Genesis. Yea, he had power over the angel and prevailed, because he wept and made supplication unto him. And that fills in the dramatic circumstance of Genesis 32. He's not just hanging on, saying, I will not let thee go. He is weeping and crying and praying and seeking God's help. And it's at that point, brothers and sisters, it's that point that he's prevailed. It's graphic, isn't it, when you think about that? To have to reduce a man to that circumstance, to get him to turn to Almighty God, is tragic to behold. But in the end, Jacob did that, weeping and crying and pleading with Almighty God for mercy and goodness, for blessing and forgiveness. And the man who had taken his brother by the heel and taken that birthright and that blessing by force is now just holding on to God, saying, please, just bless me. I realize it comes from you, God. I realize that I can't grasp it and seize it. And God yielded. And that's when he had power with God. It's a paradox, isn't it? When he had no strength, he's won. When he was powerless, he overcame. It's a paradox. Bless me. It's a little bit like what Paul said in Corinthians when he asked that God remove the thorn of the flesh. 3 times, 3 prayers, and every time God said, no, please, no, please, no. And Paul got the reason for that. God's strength is made perfect in our weakness. When we can't solve the problem, when we look to him, when we need his help, when we need his strength, that's when God's power is perfected, because he takes control. He gives the solution. He gives the deliverance. He gives the answers. This is the beginning of a different journey, isn't it? He overcame by weeping. A weak, crippled man has power with God. A weak, helpless man has prevailed against this mighty angel because he sought it by being just too little for the mercies and goodness of God. Now, as this is happening, as this victory, this paradox victory has occurred, in verse 27, the angel said to Jacob, and Jacob is still reeling with this excruciating agony in his hip. And the angel said, what is thy name? Now, the angel is not asking that question for information. God knows who Jacob is. He doesn't ask those questions to gain a sense of understanding. He asks those questions to get Jacob to think specifically, who are you? What is your name? What is your characteristic and your quality? And God just wanted Jacob not just to confess his name, but to confess the character behind that name. He wanted Jacob to say, my name is Jacob. I'm a supplanter. I'm a heel catcher. I'm a man who works with duplicity at times. I'm a man who tries to be astute in solving the problems that come before me. I am Jacob. I'm absolutely Jacob. And God wanted that acknowledgement. And Jacob gave it. willingly gave it. And in verse 28, the angel said, "Thy name shall no more be Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed." When you change people's names, you change their identity. It's a new epoch. His life as a supplanter and a deceiver was now in the mind of God to be banished completely from his life. And that humble prayer and that seeking him and hanging on to God in all of those circumstances, that was a new direction. And that faith and humility had now resulted in this change. Now, I want you to notice this. Your name's Israel. And here's the explanation of the word Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God. He was alone in the night, and he now has power with God. And that's the point. The power is power not of yourself, Jacob, but with God. He's connected to God. He's with him in every sense of the word. A prince hast thou power. The Hebrew word has the idea of acting like a prince, carrying thyself prince-like. Where's this language coming from? Come to Genesis chapter 17. This is the language of the patriarchs. In verse 6, God said to Abraham, Genesis 17, verse 6, "I will make thee exceeding fruitful, I will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee." There's a royal development here. To Sarah, in verse 16 of that chapter, "I will bless her and give thee a son also of her. Yea, I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people shall be of her." Now, that's not just talking about the fact that one day there would be a royal line of David, although that did happen. But there is something spiritual about this idea of kingship. It's the idea of dominion. It's the idea of having this sense of rulership, this sense of spiritual rulership. And for the angel to say to Jacob, "Jacob, you have now come from a heel catcher to a prince. This is now in the line of the promises I made to Abraham and to Sarah, that kings shall come out." This is the faithful dominion. This is the rulership of the mind. This is a real royal person. And it's with God. Not disconnected, for thou hast prevailed. And as I said, the paradox is that Jacob won by surrendering and by confessing his unworthiness. And in that very prevailing, God also won, as God's strength was made perfect in weakness. But the story hasn't finished there, has it? The angel asks Jacob's name, and Jacob turns to the angel and says, "Tell me, I pray thee, thy name." And the angel said in verse 29, "Wherefore is it that thou dost ask after my name?" See, Jacob's seeking to know God further. And the divine answer comes back as if to say, "Well, I've given you enough information, Jacob. You can work out my name and my character and my purpose." And he blessed him there at the river Jabbok, which means emptying. Jacob had emptied his soul. Jacob had emptied himself of everything that was the confidence of the flesh. And there at the place of emptying, the angel blessed him. That's the language of forgiveness. That's the language of blessing. It's given by Almighty God. I call the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, staring into the eyes of an angel, wrestling. And in the end, his faith had prevailed. My life is preserved. The drama of the deliverance is revealed to us in chapter 33. He's hobbling. In fact, it's so torturous to walk that Esau's got to actually come and meet him, because Jacob can't actually get to Esau. verse 4, Esau ran to meet him. And you can imagine Jacob hobbling on his thigh in excruciating agony. He can't do anything. He can't defend himself. He's in front of his wives and his children. There's absolutely defenseless before Esau. And Esau's charging towards him. And he'd be closing his eyes and thinking, what's coming next? And then to his astonishment, his absolute astonishment, Esau embraced him, fell on his neck, kissed him, and they wept. Fell on his neck. This neck, 40 years previously, had had skins. This was the very neck that had deceived Isaac. And now look at it, 40 years later. And what had happened, brothers and sisters, is that God had not only worked in Jacob's life to change him, but he'd also worked in Esau's life to change him. And that hatred and that antagonism and that murderous intent over 40 years had been dissipated. Jacob had no idea that God was at work until finally Esau grabs him and embraces him, and they wept. They wept. Everything is unexpected. And isn't that, brothers and sisters, isn't that the way God works? That we build up in our mind great fears and great anxieties, and we're worried about this and worried about that, and we take the matter to prayer, and then finally when we're actually confronted with it all, suddenly everything seems to fall into place. Have you ever experienced that? I'm sure you have. And that's the working of God. But when that total dependence upon him is part of our life, God's been working with all of those people, including ourselves. Jacob acknowledged that all these children, who are these, says Esau? Hardly recognize them. All that strife we read about, brothers and sisters, about in the family, the way in which God was working. Look at Genesis 33 and verse 5. Esau lifted up his eyes and saw the women and the children and said, who are these with thee? And Jacob said, the children which God hath graciously given thy servants. All of that intense conflict. When Jacob looked back, he saw and understood that God had worked in that family. He had produced the extraordinary, should I say, out of the ordinary. Working in the home, God has graciously given thy servants. It's a different Jacob, isn't it? An entirely different Jacob. When he finally met Esau, he said in chapter 33 and verse 10, I pray thee, if I found grace in thy sight, then receive my present at my hand, for therefore have I seen thy face as though I had seen the face of God, and thou wast pleased with me. Yeah, that's a remarkable statement when you think about it. When he looked into the face of the angel, he saw compassion and mercy. When at last God gave him that blessing. And now when he looks in the face of Esau, he sees, as it were, just a faint reflection of that same mercy in the eyes of his brother Esau. Who had arranged that? Who had changed Esau's life? Almighty God. As we leave, brothers and sisters, the chapter before us with the family making their way back to the land of their fathers, we need to understand that we can have no confidence in the flesh. None whatsoever. Any strength or intelligence or wisdom or wealth or superiority that you may feel you have, there is absolutely no confidence in the flesh. And God brought Jacob to this astounding position where all he could do was just hang on and plead for mercy and weep and cry and seek forgiveness. And because of that, he had power with God. As the proverb says, trust in Yahweh with all thine heart. Lean not to thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he will direct all our paths.